والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, welcome to our program. First, we want to thank you for your interest and dear Rothman, we really appreciate you seeing in our campus. Thank you for coming. Before we start, I want to give brief information about our guest's life. Abdallah Eric Rothman was born to a secular American family who encouraged him to find his own truth and define his own path in life. Whereas his family was neither religious nor spiritual, Abdallah was drawn to seek God from an early age, and he set out on a path of exploration and discovery. His journey took him to many distant lands where he lived and practiced the spiritual traditions of the people he lived with. These experiences enabled Abdallah to grapple with and come to understand many secrets of the human soul in his quest for the path to the truth, gathering gems of wisdom from all of the spiritual traditions of the world. He finally found them all contained in one path and eventually came to embrace Islam as what he calls a coming home to the one true path he was always seeking, and the journey he was always on. Abdallah is a psychologist, author, and researcher who works in the field of Islamic psychology. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. If you have a question after the lecture, you can write your questions and send it to us, or you can also talk. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is this it's okay? But I need to turn it on. Nothing here? It's not working? Okay. Alright. Assalamu alaikum. It's good to see everybody. Just want to first thank everybody, thank the organizers for putting this together and for inviting me to your university. I was honored to have the invitation, and I'm happy to be here. This is my first time on this side, spending much time on this side of the Bosphorus. I've come to Istanbul a lot, but this is a really beautiful campus, so I'm happy to be here. So, just to give you a brief overview of what I plan to talk about, I usually like having conversations better than I do talking at people, but so I will talk for a while about my story, but I'm more anxious to get to the part of answering questions or just having conversations. So, inshallah, we'll get there. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then talk about sort of my inner compass. I'm using the analogy of travel because we're talking about the journey to Islam, and talking about sort of this inner thing that was in me before I guess, set out on this journey and while I was on the journey, and then talk a little bit about my actual physical travels and what I was looking for and what my experiences were, and how I felt like I really had this internal sort of direction aside from just my own seeking. Felt like there was something, some connection where I was being guided. And then about how I eventually came to embrace Islam and feeling like that was really not only it was both the end of that journey and the beginning. Okay. So, as you heard a little bit about in his brief intro, in the U.S., and my family was really not religious, not very secular. But part of, I always give them credit for me becoming Muslim, because the way that I was raised was very much, which is pretty common in the U.S., of like, sort of you get to define your own truth and your own identity to a certain degree. Obviously, everybody, especially parents, have their own hopes and restrictions on what they want for their children, but really I was given the freedom to explore. And so I think from their standpoint, that meant choose what career that you want to do, choose where you want to live, this type of freedom. But for me, I was always really I believed in God. And it wasn't a sense of like that I was trying to discover or decide whether I believed in God. For me, at a very early age, that was always there. It was like solid. But what I was seeking, what I was looking for was like, how do I live with this belief? Like what path? Because I wasn't given a path of how to understand my relationship with God, and all the people around me, my family, my friends, didn't really have a notion of how God plays into life. It was more just living for the dunya, living for, you're born and then you die, and whatever you struggle to like have as much success and comfort in between that. And to me that didn't make sense. So from about, I would say, age 14, I was really looking for something, and exploring lots of traditions. So I had this thirst for knowledge, but it wasn't just study. So a lot of people ask me oh, what did you study, or what did you read? I did read, and I did seek knowledge in that way, but really to me what I was looking for was understanding myself, and really understanding who we are as human beings, and what that means for what we're supposed to do here in life. Like this idea that we're supposed to grow and develop almost like a journey. I always had this sense that we're not supposed to just live how we are, accept that as it is, and stay comfortable. It's that we're supposed to break through things about ourselves, understand deeper levels, and grow sort of spiritually. And so to me, that was a spiritual thing, and I saw that in all these different religious traditions. But living in a secular society, I wound up being called or drawn to the field of psychology, because I saw that as being like a secular version of what people look for in what I thought religion was supposed to be about. And again, my relationship to religion was really my own interpretation, because I wasn't given religion. There wasn't people telling me, this is what you have to do, and if you don't do it, you're going to go to hell, or something like this, right? It was really, I was choosing it for this reason of learning and growing. And so to me, psychology was all about learning about the self, going, this developmental sort of journey of understanding and healing, really. And so to me, that made the most sense. I needed to find something to do in my life, but the thing I was always the most passionate was about this idea of growth and understanding the self. So I went into the field of psychology, and I got a master's in psychology. And at the same time, while I was studying, I was also continuing to study all these different religions, and I traveled. So for me, there was always a link of what I was doing in psychology as a career was also the same thing that I was looking for in exploring all these different religious traditions. This knowledge of the self. And I always, to me that connection was obvious, even though when I took my psychology courses, it didn't seem like everybody else thought that was obvious, because often it was studying behavior and the brain, and I was always looking at psychology as the name, the study of the psyche, which is like the study of the soul. So anyway, I continued. I was always just really exploring like all these different ancient traditions, because I felt like they all had gems of wisdom in this understanding of the soul. And I put Jedi aspirant. I don't know if anybody is a Star Wars fan, but for me, growing up, I'm 43, so I was born in 1975, which is right when the Star Wars movies were first coming out. So this was like an influence on me. Something, I wasn't really like a science fiction geek or anything like that. What I liked about it was the Jedi Knights. And what I liked about that was that it was this order of people who were trying to maximize the human potential from this spiritual understanding. Like, so the Force in Star Wars is like this higher power, like God, and understanding your own development and strengthening your capacity to then elevate your what you're able to do. So in the movies, there were like these people that were able to do amazing things because they've trained themselves inwardly in this sort of spiritual tradition. And the thing that really connected with me about that was the doing the work on yourself spiritually, but the fact that the Jedi Order was made up of people, or not even people, but aliens in this case, from all different walks of life, right? So it wasn't just one group of people, it wasn't just human beings, they were from like different solar systems, different planets. And that always resonated with me, that what I was seeking, this path, to me was always defined by something that is for everyone. So I like the idea of looking around at sort of your brothers and sisters on the path and them looking different than you. You know, so I always had this at an early age, rejected an idea of tribalism, or that you're supposed to belong to one group of people, and that those were the people who were, you know, of this spiritual tradition. So that's a little bit about where I was coming from. And then I would say that, and I don't really take any credit for this, because ultimately I think it's something that Allah put in me, alhamdulillah, this like spark inside of me where I had this internal drive to seek the truth. Meaning, I wasn't just happy with whatever I was given. You know, a lot of people just live this sort of mundane life and they want comfort and they don't question things. And I was like, I just had this notion that there's something more that I should be striving for. And then I felt like I had this spark in me sort of led the way. And I was guided in this seeking process. And I think that the thing that allowed that guidance to, or allowed me to benefit from that guidance, because I don't think it was special to me, I think it's something that everybody has access to, is that and I would also say, I wouldn't take credit for this, maybe it has a little to do with my upbringing in this sort of free society where I get to define my own self. Also, I grew up in a privileged family, meaning like I had a lot of resources. My family wasn't wealthy, but I had resources, I had education, I had the ability to work, save money, and travel. And so all these things together allowed me to set out on this journey, both physical and spiritual, where I was open. I was open to being vulnerable, meaning I didn't decide what I was looking for before I set out to look for it. I didn't decide what I was going to find, meaning like I was open to being changed or having my mind be changed along the way. Like I didn't already have the answers, right? And so part of that was when I would take risks and I would remain open. So what I've noticed is a lot of times when people travel on a journey, they, out of comfort or even fear, we sort of close ourselves off to other people or other experiences that are unfamiliar to us because it's scary. And so we like to stay where we're comfortable. And I think even though I still also am like that, I like to be comfortable, I had this intuitive sense that if I wanted to grow and I wanted to really find the truth, I had to push myself out of my comfort zone. I had to put myself in situations where I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't necessarily know I was going to be safe. I didn't necessarily, I might lose material things. I might even sacrifice my safety. But there was something that I knew that I had to go out and put myself in these difficult situations and take a risk in order to really expose myself to that. Really, what I was looking for was the truth. Because oftentimes, I think we block ourselves off from the truth. And what I mean by the truth is not some theological truth, necessarily, but almost like a genuine experience of what is real. And often, when we live in life, we live from our thoughts and our perceptions keep us contained based on what we've decided is okay or comfortable, right? And because we're trying to avoid the unknown, because it's scary. And so I always sort of early on had this sense that I needed to break through that barrier of the unknown, and that there was something in the unknown that contained this deeper truth. So this is what was really driving me on this quest. And so eventually that internal quest became a physical journey where I traveled around the world and I was seeking these different experiences and really wanted to learn from different traditions and find guidance. Like I said, I wasn't looking to be convinced that there was a God, because I already felt that. To me it wasn't a cognitive belief. It was a inner just knowing that there was something greater. But then defining what that means, what is God, what is my relationship to God, that's the part that I needed to discover, because it was never given to me. And so it was really up to me to say well, where is that? How am I going to walk towards God? What path is there for me? And a lot of people from day one, they're given that, and so you just follow it. But so for me, I think the blessing in that was that I got to find it on my own, so it became really real for me. The danger in that is that I believe that I was guided and I was blessed to be able to be guided along that path. Whereas some people don't find that direction, and it can be really dangerous not having that path set there before them. So there's pros and cons to it. So part of this reason why I was going to all these different places and looking to different religions is that in my innate understanding of God or the truth or spirituality, I always felt like there was an interconnectedness of all human beings. That we're all here as human beings having the same experience as humans, that there's this human condition, and therefore I felt like, there's really one path. There's lots of ways of getting there, but I had this inner sense that there's this interconnectedness. So what I was doing was I was looking for common threads about humanity, because to me that felt like that's how I would discover what is really true. If I go and I live with all these different people who do things somewhat differently, at the core, what they're trying to get at is the same, because they're all humans living a human experience. And so I was looking for these common threads to know, like, well, what is really core to the human experience? And I trusted in tradition, meaning I felt like there was wisdom spread out throughout the world and throughout traditions and religions, which is something that we find in Islam. But at the time, I didn't have an understanding from a religious standpoint of that. It was just an intuitive sense that there was something, even if each one of these traditions isn't completely whole, that most of what they have is, there's something sacred there, and something of value. And I felt like this idea of trusting in tradition is like, I have a sense, and I still believe this, that when there's a tradition like that's handed on from generation to generation, the reason it survives, or the reason wisdom survives, is because there's something real about it. And so I have this faith in that sort of human tradition. And I think I was yearning for belonging, but to me, I really was resistant to this belonging to an insular group. I was looking for belonging among a group of people that were driven for the same cause of this spiritual knowledge and knowing God, rather than belonging based on where I'm from, what I look like, what bloodline I have. And to me, that wasn't what I felt like belonging should be. It's about, on the inside and in the soul, finding a connection of people who are like-minded, or I would say even like-hearted. So the way that I will talk about this journey is not necessarily in places that I went, although I'll talk about those places, but to talk about this almost like progression of my spiritual exploration. So I'll talk about connectedness, meaning just sort of this innate feeling of being connected to something outside of myself. And then nothingness, or you could say emptiness, like being, finding a place of calm, beyond like the busyness of the mind. And then multiplicity, so like coming into like theology, we're talking about different religions in multiplicity, like it could be polytheism, things like that. And then the Trinity, like so Christianity's notion of monotheism, but then also monotheism, so getting into just this notion of oneness of God, and then eventually embracing Islam. So to me, connectedness was like the first thing that I was setting out to experience. It was like, the first thing I was looking for was there has to be something beyond just this busyness of life, where people are just pursuing material comforts. And so, for me, the first time I experienced feeling this place of peace beyond that busyness was in nature. I think I grew up in a place where people spent a lot of time in the woods, but even then, that didn't necessarily mean they had a spiritual experience. They were sort of being active outside. But so I spent a lot of time connecting. Like I would go out into the woods, and I just feel like there was this power in old trees, and I would feel filled up. Like when I go to the woods and I take a deep breath, I would feel like the opposite of when you feel depleted of energy. I felt like it gave me energy. And so immediately, at that point, I was like, okay, there's something about connecting with something outside of myself to gain energy. And there's a big, in the US, there's a big Native American tradition that's very centered in this idea of spirituality in connection with nature. So like honoring the natural world and this notion that there is energy in the world that you can get filled up from. And so this, it was like this process of, by connecting with this external experience of nature, where you can look in nature and things are calm, like the trees sort of wave in the wind, things just sort of naturally do what they do. Animals don't have anxiety, they're not like angry, they're not fighting. There's destruction in nature, but there's this sense of everything's okay, everything sort of has its place. And so for me, there was something that I was connecting with nature to learn that way of being at peace. And it was like, by having that external connection, finding a place of connectedness inside. So that was, I think, the first thing. And so I spent a lot of time in my own country connecting with like Native American cultures. I would go and live with these people and do what they do. They do things like a sweat lodge, where you sit in a lodge made of wood and branches, and you put hot stones in it, and it's like you're sweating for a long time, and by detoxifying and sweating, you sort of get into this state of meditation almost, or get beyond your body or yourself and start, connecting with this inner place of peace. But then, for me, so that was a big part of my beginning. But then I felt like there was something about needing more focus on self-awareness. Like, what was it about my internal self and relationship to that external connection? And so then I went on to looking at more like meditation in Buddhism, like Zen Buddhism. There's a practice of sitting and meditation, and this idea of non-attachment. So not being attached to the world. So here, I go from connecting to the world in a different relationship to just the busyness of worldly life. But then in that connection, it was this internal, finding a place of spiritual peace inside, which was based on like almost not being attached to things in life, whether it's people, relationships, status, things that distract us, right, from this internal experience. And so I spent a lot of time meditating, like learning how to just sit and clear my thoughts. And I did this I traveled to Thailand, and I lived in the woods with a Buddhist family, and I would, we had nothing really. They were very poor, and we would fish. We would get fish out of the rivers, climb up into the mountains, and like spend a lot of time in nature, in the woods, meditating. And so I learned to quiet my mind. But then, I think always something that was, this internal compass was that I believed in God. I believed that there was something, just coming to a place in myself and finding peace in myself was missing out on this external power that is not just within myself. So there was this notion of finding that power within, but in Buddhism, there's a lot of focus on just coming to a place of emptiness in the self, which to me felt right. But then it sort of stopped there, and almost like I felt like there was a denial of something greater, something beyond. And so I was looking for a way of understanding when I come to this place of peace, now what? What does that mean in my relationship to God? In this mystery of like, how do we understand this higher power? So then I studied yoga, the tradition of yoga, which is within Hinduism, So I studied with this guy, this guru, called Baba Haridas. And he was this very old man who, he didn't speak. He had taken a vow of silence. And so all my teaching with him, he would write on a chalkboard. And he taught me, so it was still meditation, but there was this focus on yoga. So we were doing body postures, learning to hold your body in a place so that you could get beyond the discomfort of the body to sort of break through to these places of inner enlightenment. And so I would, I studied for quite a few years with this community, and was doing things like the yoga, what we know about yoga, like physical body postures, but then also there's practices of breathing called pranayama, where you're learning to control your breath and build power inside in order to get beyond the limitations of the body. And I used to have, so I went to college with some people that grew up in this community since they were young, and they were trained to do this. They would do power pranayama, so they would learn to control their breath to the point where they would take rebar, which is like this the stuff they use for building buildings. It's like very long, totally solid iron that you wouldn't be able to bend unless you're really strong. And they would take it and put it in the soft part of their throat, and then on the ground with their hands behind their back and bend the bar just with this part of their throat. And so I spent a lot of time with them. In college, we would be in our dorm, and I would I would go around and say, hey, I bet my friend can bend this rod, or rip a phone book in half. And so they were doing it based on learning to maximize and control their breath and their energy. And there was something really powerful in that. It was like learning to have this inward power. And then part of that discipline was in, so like the guru that I was studying with, he had not only taken a vow of silence, there was a time when he lived in a cave for several months and drank nothing but milk. So this idea of renunciating or rejecting things that the body needs in order to break through to this more spiritual subtlety of the human soul. And there was something in that really made sense to me. But then, all of this was rooted in polytheism, essentially. So this idea of there being multiplicity of power. So the notion of God was like, centralized into different energies or characteristics, rather than in one place. And so there was something in that resonated with me, in that, so they have all these deities, essentially, that they're calling on for power outside of themselves. So looking for, recognizing that I'm not the source of, let's say, getting your provision, getting things that you need. So looking to this outside power as being the source. So part of that made sense to me. Because you're saying, it's like this humbleness of saying, well, it's not me that can create everything. I'm needy. I'm needy of something else. But then I had this, and so I also have here the word Ifa. I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's an African religion. Yoruba religion, also practiced in South America. And it's similar of these notion of different deities. Each of which have like a domain of certain things. So it's similar to the Asma al-Husna, like the 99 names of God, except for their understanding of it is that they're separate entities. And so for me, I think I always had an innate sense of the 99 names, that made sense that there's characteristics, but that ultimately it's this one one place, one power. So I was looking for this oneness. So I took the benefits of that tradition, but then I moved on. And then my personal experience with Christianity was more, I studied Christian mysticism, which is like a little bit more of a spiritual orientation towards Christianity. But I really was drawn to Rastafarianism. So like, not the, Bob Marley who has dreadlocks and is connected to reggae music, but there's a religion underneath that was about, it's really rooted in this, similar to what Christianity is. So understanding this notion of the Trinity, that basically they believe that Jesus was a manifestation of God in the world. And in Rastafarian, they attribute that to another person who was African, because there's this notion of being connected to like the original people, and they're understanding that the origins of human beings came from Africa, and there's this connection of going back to the roots. And so there was something about that, the way that they held that. So there's this rebel soul aspect of Rastafarianism that is saying, it's almost like rejecting the notion that external dunya forces, like other people or governments, can define who you are, and sort of living this way of like for God as a warrior, sort of, that you're going to not fall into the guise of this dunya-oriented life, and really live in strength in this connection to God. And so I really connected with that, of like being a spiritual warrior to some degree. And it was really about living in the world. So all of these other things that I had done up until that point, there was a lot of like rejection of the world, so renunciation. There was something about the way that they held, they even talked about paradise being on earth, like not waiting until you die to get into this state of spiritual bliss, but like in the way that you live, like the actions, the things that you choose, the thing that you say should be manifesting that paradise in this life. And there was something to me that made sense about that. It was like living in the world in a spiritual way. And then there was this connection to the prophetic stories, like the prophets, that always had a resonation with me. I always felt like there was something to those stories, but the problem for me was two things with this. Was the Trinity, to me, didn't make sense. I had an innate sense that there was one God, and even though they talk about Christianity as a monotheistic religion, there was this confusion of like the God being manifested in the world as a personality. And so to me, that just fundamentally, philosophically didn't make sense, because my notion of God was it was beyond the world, and that God created the world, so how can God be in the world? But I also had an understanding that God is in the world in the sense that we have access as human beings to experience God directly. But that doesn't mean that, it's almost like a paradox. And so I understood this, and so I sort of rejected that part of it, but really took from it all these other things. So I went to Jamaica, and I lived with this Rastafarian family in the hills for several months, and did what they did. Like, I practiced what they practiced. I had dreadlocks that I grew, and I would practice their way of being, to the point where I really lived it and experienced it. And I had, with all these people, really spiritual experiences. So for instance, when I found this family, I just went to Jamaica. So remember I talked about having my heart open on these journeys? So when I when I arrived in Jamaica, I had a one-way ticket. I didn't know when I was coming back, and I didn't know where I was going to sleep the night that I arrived. So, I arrived at like 9 p.m. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and I had one little day pack, like a very small backpack. And I got off the plane and I opened my heart to everybody that I saw. Basically, I didn't have any expectations. I didn't have a wall in front of me saying, you are different than me. I was sort of practicing being a walking example of what I believed, that we were all connected. And people resonated with that. They tapped into that and they were inspired by it. And so people would automatically start to like take me in and help me. And then hand me off to people. Like, oh, you should, you know, I'm going to get off in 5 minutes and I'll drive you somewhere and I'll find you a place to stay. And then I went there and then I met somebody and they would ask me questions about my belief. They were almost, it's like they were testing me, am I true? And so I guess I answered their questions satisfactorily, and they took me, the next day, we hiked through some mountains, and they took me to their father's camp, and he was like this Rastafarian elder, this very old man, very famous in the community for being like a high spiritual person in that tradition. And when I arrived, everyone was looking at me strangely because they had never allowed, no white person had ever been there, no non-Jamaican or a person within their spiritual community. And so when I arrived, everyone was sort of like, well, why is he here? What's going on? But then at the same time, what they told me later is that this old man, had told his family a month before I came, before I even had a plan to come, he told his family that I was going to come. He said that this person is going to visit, and so they were all sort of looking at me like, oh my God, this is who he was talking about. And then when I came to his hut, he has like this very humble hut with a dirt floor, and he invited me in. And people said that he doesn't invite anybody that's not his own family into his home. And so when I got there, I had this sense that that this was a really auspicious connection. Like there was I sensed that that they were opening their hearts to me. And so I sort of, to continue that gesture, I took my backpack and I opened it up and I just gave them everything that was in it. And there wasn't much in it, but there was like some nice art supplies, pens and paper, so I gave that to their children. I had lived on a farm where we made our own herbal medicines, and so this guy was like really into natural medicine, and so I gave him all of these, and so then they thought I was like this medicine man, but really I just happened to have these things. I gave them to them, and then I had a very small amount of money, but I just gave them all my money. Basically what I was doing was, for my own self, reminding myself to put down these walls. Because it was this notion of, I could be really scared in that moment and cut myself off from the experience because this is foreign. It's a foreign situation. I'm way up in the hills in this mountain, in this foreign land, in a place that's somewhat dangerous. I would never advise somebody to do what I did, but because I was trusting these people and really trusting that God was going to protect me, miracles happened, I feel like. The way that things unfold and the amount of care that was shown to me by people was really profound. They sort of just accepted me as their family because I saw them as my family because of this notion that we're all one, we're all connected. And so I would say in those moments, and I had this experience in a lot of places, where me not putting up walls and me sharing everything and sort of removing barriers, that there was something that happens almost like heart to heart, where you break through these notions of definition and identity and external relationships that are based on, our notions of what religion is, or there's these people, and these people believe this, and these people believe that, and who's right, to getting to this place of like, well, we're human beings, and there's something that we share that when you don't focus on those differences, there is this like higher connection of almost an innate knowing that we're the same and that we're connected. And so, for me, that was always the most powerful thing. And it was rare that I was able to find these experiences where people were able to reflect that. A lot of times, I would visit these religious communities, and people would have this notion of, well, if you're not on our path, if you're not doing what we're doing, then you're lost. Meaning like, you need to submit to our religion in order to be saved or to be okay with God. And this turned me off, because to me, I always had this notion that, well, God knows what's in my heart, and we can't define people based on the external. There's something that needs to be honored in terms of this internal connection. And so it was this problem of tribalism. So the problem, even though I had this connection, at the end of the day, they identified with this religion that really, in this case, in Rastafarian, there was a notion that the African people had a special place in terms of their connection to God. And the reason they developed that, in my opinion, is because they were their whole lives enslaved and told that they were less than human because they're black. And so as a way of understanding, to reclaim their worthiness, which they deserve, they took it to the other extreme and said, well, we're, as black people, we're a higher status. And so that became problematic because my skin is not black. I'm not from Africa. Even though I had all these other connections, there was this external thing that now excludes me from this group. Whereas everything else about what our belief in God and our way of striving to understand, we had this spiritual connection. And so this is why I moved on from a lot of these places, is that what I was looking for was that inclusiveness, that the only thing that should define our connection is our struggling and striving to know God. And so I moved on, and eventually realized that what I'm looking for is this monotheistic, that there's one God, but that there's and that there's, I had this connection to the prophets. So I studied Judaism as well. Like, I went to Palestine and Israel, both. I say both because there's parts of the country, of that land, that you're in Israel because everyone in there has the mentality of that's the state of Israel. And then you can go right next, in the same land, and you're in Palestine because of the notion of what people's connection is, right? And so I stayed with Jews and Muslims, but at that time I wasn't really yet discovered Islam. And so what I found in Judaism was that there was this connection to the prophets, these stories that you find in the Quran and the Old Testament, that resonated with me. And I felt like, as I was journeying in all these different religions, I was taking these inner things that would get me to these different spiritual states, like meditation, the things of yoga, like getting beyond the body. But ultimately, what I felt was missing was something to contain all of that. So I found that I could reach really high states of feeling spiritually connected. But then there was like a ceiling that I couldn't get to in my growth, because I felt like I needed a container for that light. So like, you can experience this like oneness of God and all the positive feelings of love and connectedness, but then in order to continue holding that, I felt like I needed an established path or a vessel to hold that light. What I mean is some sort of external rules and laws to abide by. See, coming from where I grew up, where I didn't have to submit to a religion and I got to make all my own decisions and everything goes, I was taking bits and pieces from these different religions and traditions, but I didn't have to submit to any one of them. So I could make my own choices of, well, this sounds good to me, this sounds good to me, this sounds good to me, and meanwhile I wasn't following any one religion. And what I found was, it was starting to, I was hitting a glass ceiling, like I couldn't grow beyond that. So one time I heard a story of, there was a knight who was trying to save a princess in a castle. And he's trying to break into the castle to save her and chipping away at the cement on the outside of the castle. So day in and day at night, he's chipping away, little by little, and he's getting only a little bit away, and he gets frustrated after several days. He's like, I'm not getting anywhere. So he goes around to the other corner and starts from the beginning, starts chipping away at it, chipping away, and he gets a little bit, and he gets frustrated. He's like, I'm not getting in. So he goes around to the other side and does the same thing, chipping away, and he just gives up because he's frustrated that he's not advancing. Whereas if he would have just committed to one path and continued through, all that same effort would have got him to where he was trying to go into the castle. So when I heard that, it occurred to me that I needed to commit to a path. Whereas before I was resistant to that because I thought that that was going to limit my freedom. By committing to one path, I would be limited in terms of like my freedom to make choices or to think a certain way, and so the thing that I found that a lot of my friends who are on a similar spiritual journey of like taking from these different traditions, a lot of them today are still, I feel like, stuck because they didn't commit to a path. Because what they're missing is this outer way of almost a science, these outer, what some people think of as just ritual, are like almost a science of how we advance in our development. And so I found that, in Judaism, there was this outer law. You do things a certain way, and that there's meaning behind those outer laws in order to contain and advance in your spiritual trajectory to know God. But then, the biggest problem that I had was, again, this tribalism. Even more so than the Rastafarians, who was about their place of origin or their skin color. With Judaism, this notion of the chosen people, that like by being, you could only this certain people with this certain bloodline were able to reach an elevated status with God. And I would study with these rabbis trying to grapple, like, well, how does that make sense if the whole point of how we define somebody who is on this path is somebody who is struggling to know God? And so if that's an internal process, how should somebody's bloodline, or what group they're from, or what culture they're from, define their status with God? And so, to me, always what I was looking for, like I said from the beginning with my connection to the Jedi Order, is that there were people from all walks of life. And so the thing that connects us needs to be this definition of who you are as a seeker or as a person of God is an internal process of doing the work on your soul to advance and develop in this way. And that is the ultimate reason for religion. The ultimate reason for these external things that you follow, these laws or rules or ways of praying, I I came to realize that they were there not as the definition themselves. So you could do all those external things. So I've met people who did all of the things on the outside, they did all of the external practices, but then inside they were still like, their souls were dirty. Like they hadn't been doing the cleaning inside. It was just an external relationship. But the people that I came from sort of did the opposite. They did all this internal work, and they were trying to get these spiritual states, but then they rejected the external path. And so I found that this is what I needed to do, was bring these two things together and commit to a path. And so, alhamdulillah, I found Islam. It was like the last thing that I came to. I had studied all these other religions, and it was when I was just finishing my degree in psychology, and I was looking for something, a way of understanding psychology from a spiritual development way. And so this is what led me to find out about Islam, was through a group of people practicing Sufism. And the reason they were being taught by a sheikh from Palestine. And his way of teaching them, they were all like, at the time it was in the US, in America, and Americans have they're very secular, like a lot of people here. There's a similarity to sort of this rejection of religion, thinking that it's backwards. And so what he did was he gave them the beauty of the inner path, and then slowly sort of helped them realize that they need this external path. And so even though I think for me, I was okay, I had already come to realize that I needed an external path. And so, but I don't know that I would have been open to it had it not come from this tasawwuf-oriented version of Islam. Because the people that taught me Islam, this feeling of coming home was this very specific way that they dealt with me. Is that, remember how I said that everywhere I would go, this group of people would ultimately make you feel like if you're not doing what they're doing, then you're lost. These people looked to me, they were Muslim, they were praying 5 times a day, they were practicing Islam, but the way that they approached me was, they allowed me they saw me that I could potentially be on a higher connection with God than they are. Even though I wasn't Muslim, I wasn't doing what they do, they were doing it, they believed that this was the way, but at the same time that they were committed to their own religion, they understood that my own journey was with God, and that only God can know what's truly in my heart. So it wasn't my external practices that defined my spiritual status. It was, where I am internally and the work that I'm doing on my heart. And so when I felt this, it was like, whoa, this is exactly what I was looking for all along, was that the definition of somebody in this group as a Muslim was defined by somebody who is in a state of Islam, not defined by what they do, what they wear, what they look like, the practices that they're doing, or what culture they come from. It was about what are you doing internally to work on yourself and your relationship with God. And so, to me, that was the missing piece in all these other religions. And so my first experience of Islam was that. And I understand that's not a lot of people's experience of Islam. But what I came to also discover is that that's actually the core of Islam. Like that even the word Muslim is an active verb. You're in a state of Islam. It's not a religion that you decide to become. So like when people say, oh, you converted to Islam. And, people have this term revert in Islam, because the idea that I'm not fundamentally changing anything about who I am. All I'm doing is recognizing my state as a human being and that I'm submitting to this state of being Muslim. And so when I looked around at all the people who were Muslim in this group, some of them had really dark skin, some of them had really light skin, some of them spoke English, some of them were from Syria, some of them were from Palestine, some of them were blonde hair, blue eyes. You know, it was like this, one of my teachers said it's like a group of strangers, you know, and that we all come together and that we learn from each other's customs, but that we don't focus on the differences because we just say, oh, you eat that? Oh, great. This is what you do on your holidays? That's wonderful. But then underneath, the connection is about our relationship with God and that process of struggling for God. And so this is what felt like coming home to me. That whole journey that I was on, I was taking these little gems and pieces from all these different traditions, and at a certain point I got to the point where I thought I was going to have to create my own path. Like, oh, I'll take from here, and I'll take from here, and I'll just put them together and, you know, create this external path for myself. And then I found Islam, and it was like immediately obvious that it had all of these pieces that I had gathered, and that was just the beginning. That it was like a whole another world of being able to actually now, you know, it wasn't like ending the journey, it was like getting to the place of beginning the journey. And so, to me it felt like a whole path. It was like holistic with all of the things that I had gathered. So there was this connection to nature, which I think nowadays a lot of Muslims don't realize is part of Islam. But there's a whole tradition of prophetic medicine, of using natural things from the earth, having a connection to the cycles of the earth. So like we pray with the sun, we fast in Ramadan at a certain time of the month. There's a connection to the cycles of nature. So I had that. This idea of non-attachment that I found in like Buddhism was also in Islam, not being attached to dunya and living for dunya, and also disciplining yourself through these practices to renounce that attachment, but then this balance of living in the world, which I also found in these other things, and so that those two things exist at the same time. Having this outer law, you know, these rules and these practices that you do on the outside, but that the reason you do those things on the outside is to hold this spiritual experience. And then the fact that all Muslims are from every part of the world. It's not a group of people. You know, you don't get to be Muslim by nature of your bloodline. It's by nature of your witnessing who you are as a human being. And that was the biggest thing for me, is that's, you know, the true religion is for all people. And there's one truth that's not defined by some external notion of who we are, but the reality of who people are in their soul. So it's like one God, one people. And to me, I found those things, ironically, in my study of psychology. It culminated at the same point that I found Islam. And so for me, the two things are like not different. It's not that, so my work that I do is in Islamic psychology. And a lot of people think that's blending two different worlds, like somehow pasting Islam on top of psychology. But to me, psychology is the study of the soul. It's understanding how we grow and develop and make sense of difficulties in life. And people attribute this to, you know, there's a whole science within Islam that is in Sufism. Tasawwuf is a science of the soul, of learning how to work on your heart to grow and develop. And a lot of people see psychology as some separate thing in life. A lot of people see Tasawwuf as some separate thing about Islam that you don't need, that some people can do it. But what I came to see is that Islam is a psychology. It is a way of understanding our experience and giving us tools to work on ourselves So there is no Islam just by doing external practices. If it's not working on your heart and helping you grow and develop to be not only a better person, but more in witnessing of your ultimate servanthood to God, then it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. You know, and so this idea of psychology of working on ourselves, or even the notion of healing, to me is what Islam should be. It should be about cleaning ourselves so that we're moving somewhere in our lives, not just sort of staying stagnant and staying comfortable. So I'll stop there, and I would like to, I'm happy to answer questions, but also don't necessarily think that I have the answers to everything. It can be more of a discussion, or, you know, comments, and also if there's anything that I didn't talk about that you had hoped that I would talk about or thought that we would touch on, please feel free to bring that up. Do we have like a microphone?
Yeah. You should limit the question parts 20 minutes due to market time. Microphone circulation. Microphone will be circulated. Before I mentioned, if you want to, you can write your questions on a paper, then send it to us, or give it your close friends. Whatever you choose, it's okay for us. Yeah. We can take one by one.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? Brother, one question that I have already asked here in this very hall I visited first time.
We can hear you.
Yes. Okay, the question is that why do we read Quran? How can we inculcate this aspect of Islamic psychology, in our minds? Like we read Quran, I think every Muslim might be reading at least, in a week or every day. But do you think there would be some way, where we can inculcate this, aspect, that means the psychological aspect of Islam, in our minds, and then accordingly we might translate into our actions. I hope you got my question. Second question would be about, I think, really this journey, to me, back to my life. I mean, while one, tries to be practical in Islam, and I think I can relate this journey, to some extent with my own self, although I've been a Muslim, born Muslim. So, did you find, what sort of similarities do you find in all the religions, and then when you came to Islam? Can you please, talk more about that? Thank you so much.
So, in terms of the Quran, can you hear me? Is it on? The way that I became Muslim was not by reading the Quran. It was by being around people who emulated what is in the Quran, which is what the Prophet ﷺ, why he came, right? He's the Quran walking. And the reason we need that is because the Quran is not something that you're supposed to read and from reading it understand Islam. It is, the first thing it says in the Quran is this is a book for people who believe. What does that mean? It means you're not supposed to approach it in order to believe. You're supposed to already believe and then use the Quran to understand in a deeper way. But how you understand in a deeper way is by being around, first of all, it was being around the Prophet, because he was the embodiment of the Quran. And there's no way that we can understand what the Quran means without his embodiment. And so, because he's not around physically now, we need to, there is a chain of transmission of understanding what he understood from this Quran. And so we have to sit at the feet of people who understand it and are living it and breathing it to understand it. So for me, I had the blessing of being able to sit at the feet of many shayukh who are part of that transmission of experiential knowledge. And every time I tried to say that I wanted to study Quran or study books knowledge, they would guide me not away from it, because obviously you have to do that, but they were trying to preserve, I think, in me this notion of this lived experience of Islam, and that you can get off track by trying to cognitively understand what is in the Quran. So one of my teachers told me, had this term that he used in terms of like that the Quran and how its relationship is to in Islam, he called it sonic theology. So sonic, like sound, theology, meaning that just by recitation of the Quran, you can receive the message. So even if you don't understand Arabic and you maybe don't have the benefit of being around teachers to help you understand what you're reading, just by reciting the Quran, it's a shifaa, there's a healing. And that doesn't just mean like when you're sick, you have somebody read Quran on you. It means by reading it, there's a sonic, there's the vibration of the words. Like literally the reason why we have tajweed, like there's a reason why the Prophet ﷺ said the Quran, not just wrote it, but said it in a specific way. And when you say it in this specific way, it unlocks sort of like this mystical way of learning what it means in you. And so our relationship, I think, to the Quran needs to be more experiential and less academic or cognitive. Because there's lots of people who are scholars and can have read all of the tafsir and, but they're not like emulating the character of the Prophet. And so then what's the point? It needs to move people's hearts. And if it's not, then the relationship to the Quran is off. So that's the first question. The other one was, I think, harder to answer because I tried to do that in what I was talking about in the past hour. Like, I think you were asking what is common among all of these different religions. I think the most important thing that I found that was most common was people have an innate desire to understand their purpose for being here in this world. We're here and we don't have like the insight to know, because it's difficult. There's so much difficulty in living this life. There's trials, there's tribulation, and I think people always get stuck on this question of like, well, if there's a God, or if God is good, then why is there all this war, and why is there all this pain and struggle? And I think that's the biggest thing that I found is people need to make sense existentially of why they're here in the world. And so I think Islam does a better job than any of the other religious traditions because it positions this as a place of being tested. So that there is actually meaning in the difficulty. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the lives of the prophets, they all had difficulty. They were all, on a higher level than all of us, and yet they had difficulty, not because they were being punished, but because with difficulty is when you get to know God closer. You become more face to face with your status as being needy of Allah when you when you're failing at trying to have a self-directed life or find comfort in the world, because we're not supposed to be comfortable here. We're supposed to be comfortable in Jannah, in Akhirah. And so I think this is the biggest thing that I find is almost like philosophically what people are looking for in religion. And I think a lot of them give, and this is my experience in people's relationship with those religions, is that there's somewhat unsatisfactory answers. Because it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's difficult and it's hard, you just have to try to forget about it and focus on. But instead, in Islam, it's like, no, don't forget about it, don't avoid it, don't try to just numb yourself to it. Actually understand that there's wisdom and value in the difficulty itself, and that is transformative. So I think that's a hard question to answer, so I don't know if I did.
Thank you so much. If you would allow me, can I ask one more question?
Can we come back to you and let's let
Thank you
somebody
so
else? Yeah, sorry.
Selamünaleyküm. As a person, I was born into Islam, and the tasawwuf that you are trying to describe was in fact tried to live by my grandma. And unfortunately, in Turkish context, it wasn't a piece of cake at all. And in my very personal journey to know Allah, I had to cut off the Islam that my family wanted to impose on me. And unfortunately, the Islam that my friends wanted to impose on me. And I realized that body politics and the relationship with religion and Islam and how Islam is manipulated to control the people's mind, unfortunately. And I've been to Mecca 3 times, unfortunately. Each time I've experienced very different things. And as you know, you have a white privilege, and people are more prone to listen to you just because you know English. And just because, I mean, my family loves such people who converted into Islam and just because they American and they discovered Islam, but without realizing what they are doing to their kids in the name of Islam. So, by the way, I'm studying self-orientalism here, and I aware that everything at the political level and among my friends, how they understood Islam and what they want about Islam. And you are here right now among the people whose families right now are quite rich and quite okay, I don't want to discuss with them. Okay, I'll just stop there. So at this stage, what I've done to quit the school and try to find the people who are really trying to something, as you said, find a connection between God and himself or herself, whatever. So at that stage, what do you think such people who are born into Islam, who saw the things that were done in the name of Islam, should do? Because there are lots of people like you on YouTube. We love watching them. Love them. We love, who speak very perfect British English and then explain, let's say, proselytize Islam.
Right.
But in fact, it's just a performance for me. But I need something more concrete to the way to the truth, or hakikat, if you will.
Okay.
Thank you, Allah.
I would say, and again, I think I recognize my privilege, not necessarily even just the white privilege and what that is sociologically, but my privilege in being able to have the freedom to choose and understand my own relationship with my own path because of the sort of even intellectual privilege that I've been given, right? But I think it's every person's duty or responsibility, or I would say even purpose in life, is to understand your individual relationship with God. That's why you're here. That's why you're in this life, for no other reason. And so, however you need to do it, you need to figure it out. That shouldn't be defined by some external notion of what that looks like, that's going to get in the way of you really coming to know yourself. So I think, ultimately, people who are born into Islam still need to do, to some degree, what I did, of like finding Islam. I don't think you should just take what you've been given. I think you need to discover it for yourself. And that may mean going through a cycle or a period in your life where you have to reject some aspects of it. I say that because I think it's true, but I'm scared to say that because I have my own children who I am raising Muslim. But I would be a hypocrite if I said you have to wear hijab and you have to do this, and this, or by this age. Because I know that had I been given that, I probably would have rejected it. Because part of what led me to Islam was my rebellious nature of like, I want to define my own path. So I tell my oldest daughter is 10 right now. And she sees her mom wearing hijab, and she's eventually, she says, well, what age should I start wearing it? I was like, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to tell you even that you have to do it, because then you're going to do it for me. I don't want you to do it for me. I want you to do it for the sake of Allah. And if you that's what's more important to me. Because then what is it? It's other than that, it's just a piece of cloth on her head. It's not actually hijab. Hijab, means so much more. It's protection. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think each individual needs to discover God themselves. And you can't just take something because somebody else is telling you to do it, because then it's belief. You're trusting this other person. Maybe they have it right, and that's why I'm doing it. When really, most of the people who are telling you that, they don't have it right anyway. They maybe have bits of it right, or they're connected to this tradition that is right, but then what people have done with that tradition is oftentimes wrong, or off course. But what you don't want to do is, there's this saying in the US, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. Everybody, I know it sounds really weird if you don't, but like,